I changed the locks on my family's home and had a court freeze their $15 million fortune right before Christmas. When they returned, they were homeless and broke. People called me cruel, but they didn't know they used my dead grandfather's final gift to do it. My name is Rosemary, and this story begins on a frigid December afternoon that felt colder than any Hudson Valley winter I'd ever known. I was driving my beat-up sedan 4 hours north from Boston, the car packed with carefully wrapped gifts, my mind filled with images of Christmas lights and the scent of pine. I'm a historical architecture student, you see, and my family's ancestral home isn't just a house to me. It's a legacy, a testament to generations. But as I turned onto our long, tree-lined driveway, a knot of ice formed in my stomach. The house stood dark against the falling snow, a silent, hollowed-out version of itself. Inside, there was no tree, no familiar chaos, only my grandmother, Beatrice, sitting alone in the grand dining room, picking at microwaved turkey on a china plate. On the marble mantelpiece, where stockings should have been hung, was a single, hastily scribbled note. It read, "Dearest Rosie, an unexpected investment opportunity in the Bahamas came up. Used your $50,000 trust fund from Grandpa as seed money. Think of it as an investment for the whole family. Back in 5. Take care of Grandma. Love, Mom and Dad." The air left my lungs. That trust wasn't just money. It was my future, a final gift from the one man who truly understood me. Beatrice looked at me, her 5-year-old eyes clear and sharp as glass. "They've desecrated your grandfather's memory," she said, her voice devoid of weakness. "We will hold them accountable." I just nodded, the shock too deep for words. 5 days later, it wasn't just my money on the line. It was their entire $15 million estate, and its fate rested squarely in my hands. If you've ever felt the chill of being left behind, of being the afterthought in your own family, take a second to hit that like button. It tells me I'm not alone in this fight. Before I tell you how my grandmother and I began plotting one of those family revenge stories you only read about online, you need to understand who we were up against. My father, Arthur, is a good man at heart, but weak-willed, easily swayed by my mother, Dolores. Mom's entire identity is built on social standing and the illusion of wealth, an illusion that was becoming increasingly expensive to maintain. My brother, Walter, believes the world owes him a living simply for breathing, and my sister, Brenda, lives in a self-absorbed bubble, oblivious to anyone's needs but her own. I was the responsible one, the fixer, the one who worked 3 jobs in college so I wouldn't be a burden. My grandfather saw it all. He was a brilliant, self-made man who left behind a carefully constructed will. He left the house and the bulk of his $15 million estate in my father's name, but with a critical condition, a moral stewardship clause. It stated that if my parents ever demonstrated gross financial negligence or acted against the family's legacy, control of the entire trust would be forfeited. He knew their weaknesses. That $50,000 he left directly to me wasn't just a gift, it was a test. And by stealing it, my parents hadn't just stolen from me, they had triggered the very clause designed to protect the family from their own worst impulses. They had started a clock ticking that they didn't even know existed. Let me know in the comments, were you ever the family's designated fixer? Type savior if you were always cleaning up the messes, or star if you were the golden child who could do no wrong. I'm genuinely curious to see the balance in our community. That first night, fueled by stale coffee and a burning sense of injustice, Grandma Beatrice laid out the whole ugly truth. The Bahamas trip wasn't some spontaneous vacation. It was an act of pure desperation. "Your mother," she began, her voice sharp, "has been listening to some snake oil salesmen on the internet promising tenfold returns on exclusive real estate opportunities. It turned out my family was drowning. They'd been living far beyond their means for years, and to cover their losses from one of my father's failed business ventures, they had taken out a high-interest, private loan against the one thing my grandfather held sacred, the house. They had secretly mortgaged our family's legacy. The $50,000 wasn't for my ties and sunshine. It was the buy-in fee for a scam investment seminar in Nassau, a last-ditch, idiotic gamble to save themselves. The betrayal was so much deeper than I could have imagined. They hadn't just stolen my future, They had risked our entire family history on a get-rich-quick scheme. They had spat on my grandfather's grave for a chance to keep up appearances. Staring at the evidence of the loan documents Beatrice had found hidden in my father's desk, the sheer, calculated nature of their decision hit me. They had weighed their pride against my security, their desperation against my grandfather's dying wish, and made their choice. My pain began to curdle, hardening into something cold and clear: resolve. They hadn't just made a mistake, they had declared war on their own family. And they were about to find out that my grandmother and I were prepared to fight back. The next morning, the house was still, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't empty anymore, it was filled with purpose. Before the sun had fully risen over the Hudson, Grandma Beatrice was on the phone, her voice as crisp as the winter air. She wasn't calling a friend, she was calling a weapon. His name was Mr. Abernathy, our family's estate lawyer for over 40 years, and one of my grandfather's oldest and dearest friends. He was a man of integrity from a bygone era, the kind of person who believed a man's word was his bond. I sat listening on the extension, my heart pounding. Beatrice didn't waste time with pleasantries. She laid out the facts: the empty house, the note, the stolen trust fund, the secret mortgage. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, so profound I thought the call had dropped. When Mr. Abernathy finally spoke, his voice was low, laced with a quiet fury that was more terrifying than any shouting could ever be. "Beatrice," he said slowly, "your husband foresaw this. He prayed he was wrong, but he foresaw it. The moral stewardship clause, it's ironclad. What they've done, this is the precise definition of gross negligence." In that moment, he wasn't just a lawyer. He was the guardian of my grandfather's legacy, an ally we desperately needed. We had our mission, and now we had our general. If this story is hitting you hard, don't forget to hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that stories of fighting back matter, and it tells me that my voice is being heard. With Mr. Abernathy on our side, the mission crystallized. We called it Operation Legacy. It wasn't just about getting my $50,000 back. It was about saving the entire estate from my family's recklessness. Over a secure video call, the three of us mapped out our strategy like generals planning a campaign. The first phase was reconnaissance. Mr. Abernathy's legal assistants began a discreet but thorough investigation, pulling property records that confirmed the secret mortgage and digging into the so-called investment group in the Bahamas, which, as expected, was a fraudulent shell corporation. My job was to gather evidence from inside the house. I went through my father's study, my hands shaking as I photographed overdue bills, threatening letters from creditors, and the glossy, deceptive brochure for the seminar that had lured them in. Every piece of paper told a story of desperation and deceit. Meanwhile, Grandma Beatrice, with a memory sharper than any hard drive, documented every instance of their financial irresponsibility over the last decade, creating a timeline of negligence that was both heartbreaking and damning. As we compiled the dossier, a grim picture emerged. This wasn't a single bad decision. This was the catastrophic endpoint of years of vanity, denial, and entitlement. Mr. Abernathy was clear. Our case for invoking the stewardship clause was overwhelmingly strong. The final step was to prepare the ultimatum, a legal document that would be their judgment day upon their return. We were no longer victims of their chaos. We were the architects of their consequences. On the third day, we made our first overt move. It was quiet, decisive, and deeply symbolic. While my family was likely sipping watered-down cocktails and listening to a con artist's promises, Grandma Beatrice and I were erasing them from their own home. I called a 24-hour locksmith from a nearby town, a man named George whose number I found in an old phone book. He arrived in a nondescript van, his face unreadable as I explained that we'd had a security issue and needed every external lock changed immediately. As he worked, the rhythmic sound of drilling and clicking metal felt like a changing of the guard. Each old lock that was removed, each new one that was installed, was a small victory. This wasn't just about preventing them from walking back in as if nothing had happened. It was a statement. For 25 years, I had navigated their world, lived by their rules, and absorbed their chaos. They had always held the keys, both literally and figuratively. As George handed me a fresh set of solid brass keys, the cold, heavy weight in my palm felt like power. I was no longer a guest in my own life, waiting for permission to enter. I was taking control of the threshold. We were securing the perimeter, not just of the house, but of our new reality. From this moment on, no one would enter this legacy, this sanctuary, without our express permission. They had left me behind, and in doing so, they had forfeited their right to come home. With the house secured, the next move was the one that sealed their fate. It was time to take away their power source, the money. The following morning, Mr. Abernathy called. "Rosemary, Beatrice," he said, his voice grave, "I'm about to file the motion. Once I do, there's no turning back. Are you certain?" I looked at my grandmother, who gave a single, firm nod. "We are," I said, my voice not wavering. An hour later, he called back. "It is done. I have filed an emergency petition with the county court to temporarily freeze the entire $15 million estate, pending an investigation into fiduciary misconduct." He explained what that meant in simple terms. Their credit cards, which were tied to the trust, would be declined. Any checks they wrote would bounce. The endless river of cash that had funded their irresponsible lives had just been dammed. They were on an island in the Bahamas, completely unaware that they were now financially stranded. The feeling was terrifying and liberating all at once. We had severed the cord. This was no longer just a family dispute. It was a legal proceeding. We were taking a legacy back from the brink, but in doing so, I knew I was detonating the family I had always known. It was a necessary amputation. Sometimes, you have to cut off a limb to save the body. The countdown to their return had begun, and they were flying home to a world that no longer belonged to them. Have you ever had to make a hard choice that you knew was right, but it still broke your heart to do it? Just type yes in the comments if you know that feeling. I want to know I'm not alone. The silence in the house for the next 48 hours was heavy with anticipation. We tracked their return flight online, watching the tiny airplane icon crawl across the digital map, a harbinger of the coming storm. The day they were due to arrive, a light snow began to fall, blanketing the Hudson Valley in a pristine, almost peaceful, white. It felt like a cruel irony. The world outside looked pure and calm, while inside, we were preparing for a confrontation that would be anything but. Grandma Beatrice was a pillar of strength, directing me as we prepared simple meals and organized the legal documents on the dining room table, turning it into a war room. I, on the other hand, was a mess of nerves, pacing the length of the oriental rug in the living room, my stomach churning with a cocktail of dread and determination. What would their faces look like? Would there be rage? Tears? Or worse, would they try to manipulate me, to make me feel like the villain in this story? I replayed the confrontation in my head 1,000 times. Then, late in the afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from our home security app. Motion detected in the driveway. I peered through the thick, antique glass of the front window. A black airport shuttle was navigating our snow-dusted driveway. They were here. My family emerged from the vehicle, not with the triumphant glow of savvy investors, but with slumped shoulders and weary faces. The Bahamas had clearly not been the miracle they had hoped for. The defeat hung around them like a shroud, and in that moment, I knew. The power had already shifted. They just didn't know it yet. My father, Arthur, fumbled for his keys, his face a mask of weary irritation. I watched on the security monitor as he jammed the key into the lock, once, twice, then a third time with growing force. "What the hell?" he muttered, loud enough for the doorbell camera's microphone to pick it up. My mother bustled forward. "Arthur, for heaven's sake, don't break the key." "Let me try." Her key failed too, of course. The four of them stood on the porch, a confused and frustrated huddle, the cold starting to seep into their thin resort wear. That's when I pressed the button on the intercom, my voice broadcasting to the porch with cold, digital clarity. "Your keys don't work anymore." Four heads snapped up to look at the camera. It was my mother who found her voice first. "Rosemary? Thank God. Open the door, honey, we're freezing." I took a breath. "I can't do that," I said, my voice even. "But I have arranged a meeting for you. In 30 minutes. At Mr. Abernathy's office downtown." The confusion on their faces curdled into outrage. A meeting? With a lawyer? My father boomed. What is this nonsense? This is my house. You open this door right now. No, I said simply. This isn't a discussion we're going to have on the porch. Your choices are to be at that meeting, or you can find a hotel. The conversation is happening, with or without you. I then cut the connection, leaving them in a stunned, freezing silence. They were no longer in charge. The rules had changed, and the game was now being played on my terms. If you've ever had to fight for your own worth, for your own space, this story is for you. Subscribe and join a community of people who understand that sometimes the quietest revenge is simply taking back control. Mr. Abernathy's conference room was a fortress of law and old money. The walls were lined with leather-bound books that smelled of aged paper and authority. Grandma Beatrice and I were seated on one side of a sprawling mahogany table, the polished surface reflecting the grim set of our jaws. We were there first, a deliberate choice. We were not the accused, we were the plaintiffs. My family arrived 10 minutes late, a chaotic flurry of melting snow and misplaced indignation. Their colorful, slightly too casual resort attire looked garish and flimsy in the somber, wood-paneled room. They were like actors who had wandered onto the wrong stage. Mr. Abernathy, looking every bit the elder statesman in his tailored wool suit, did not rise to greet them. He simply gestured to the chairs opposite us with a tip of his pen. Arthur, Dolores, please, sit. My father started to bluster immediately. Now see here, Abe, this is ridiculous. Whatever issue Rosemary has. Mr. Abernathy cut him off, not by raising his voice, but by lowering it. This is not a family squabble, Arthur, he said, his tone glacial. This is a formal meeting to discuss a serious breach of fiduciary duty regarding your late father's estate. The legal term hung in the air, sucking the oxygen out of my father's argument. My mother looked pale, glancing around the room as if seeking an escape route. My siblings, Walter and Brenda, for the first time in their lives, looked small and utterly out of their depth. The power had not just shifted, it had been transferred entirely. They were no longer in their comfortable home, but in a court of law, and they were about to be judged. Mr. Abernathy let the silence hang for a moment before sliding a thick, leather-bound folder to the center of the table. It landed with a soft, final thud. This, he began, is a legal settlement. It contains your future. There are 2 options on the table, and you will choose one before you leave this room. He opened the folder, his movements precise. Option A. You will sign this agreement, which voluntarily cedes all financial control of the Wilson Family Trust to an independent third-party executor to be overseen by Beatrice. You will be given a modest monthly stipend to live on. You may continue to reside in the house, provided it is maintained. And you will repay Rosemary's $50,000 in full, starting immediately. He paused, letting the terms sink in. My mother looked like she was going to be sick. Or, Miss Abernathy continued, his voice dropping an octave, there is option B. You refuse to sign. In which case, I will immediately file our petition to have the moral stewardship clause fully enacted. We will present evidence of the secret mortgage, the fraudulent investment, and the theft of Rosemary's trust. The court will strip you of your inheritance. You will be removed from the house and left with nothing but the debts you've accrued in your own names. He leaned back. The choice is yours. A life of managed consequences, or complete ruin. The air in the room was so thick I could barely breathe. This was it. The checkmate. Their entire world, built on a foundation of entitlement, had just been reduced to a single, devastating choice. We all face moments that define the rest of our lives. What would you have chosen in that moment? Pride or survival? Let me know in the comments. I truly want to understand what you think. What followed was not an explosion, but an implosion. My father, Arthur, seemed to shrink in his chair, the blustering anger draining out of him, leaving behind the hollowed-out shell of a man. He just stared at the document, his mouth slightly agape, as if he couldn't comprehend the words. All the fight was gone. The real spectacle was my mother. Her first reaction was denial, a brittle, high-pitched laugh that sounded like breaking glass. This is a joke, she said, looking from me to Beatrice. A cruel, twisted joke. When neither of us responded, Her denial curdled into a venomous rage directed at me. You would do this to your own family? After everything I've sacrificed for you, the ballet lessons, the summer camps? I gave you everything. Her voice cracked, and the performance shifted to tears, great, theatrical sobs meant to guilt and manipulate. But the words were empty. They were the same lines she'd used my whole life to get her way, but in the sterile, legal atmosphere of that room, they had no power. Walter and Brenda were ghosts at the table, their faces pale with shock. Their entire future, which they had always taken for granted, was being dismantled before their very eyes. They looked at their parents, perhaps for the first time seeing not invincible providers, but flawed, desperate people who had gambled away their birthright. The illusion of the perfect, powerful family shattered right there on that mahogany table, leaving only the ugly, raw truth. And in the face of that truth, they had no defense. It was Grandma Beatrice who broke the stalemate. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at her son, my father, and said, "Arthur, your father built an empire from nothing. He gave you every advantage, every opportunity, and you have squandered it chasing fantasies while your daughter worked to build a real future. Look at her. Look at what you've done." My father finally lifted his gaze and looked at me. For the first time, I think he truly saw me not as his child, an extension of himself, but as a separate person he had deeply wronged. He visibly deflated, the last ounce of fight leaving him. With a trembling hand, he reached for the pen Mr. Abernathy had placed in the center of the table. "We'll sign," he whispered, his voice raspy. He didn't look at my mother. One by one, they signed the document that handed over their lives. The scratch of the pen on the thick, formal paper was the only sound in the room. My mother's signature was a furious, jagged slash. My brother and sister signed like children completing a punishment they didn't fully understand. When my father slid the signed document back across the table, there was no triumph in my heart. There was only a profound, aching sadness and the quiet, steely satisfaction of justice. This wasn't the end of our family, but it was the end of the family as we knew it. It was the necessary, painful end to the lies. The truth has a cost, doesn't it? Tell me something in the comments. Have you ever had a moment where the truth, no matter how painful, was the only way forward for your family? I want to hear your story. That drive back to the house was the quietest car ride of my life. The 5 of us were now bound by a legal document, strangers sharing a bloodline. When we walked through the front door to which I now held the master key, the house felt different. It was still our home, but the lines of power had been redrawn. The first few weeks were an exercise in brutal adjustment. My mother's first act of rebellion was to try and go on a shopping spree, only to have her credit card unceremoniously declined at her favorite boutique. The humiliation was a stark lesson in our new reality. My father, stripped of his role as patriarch, drifted through the house like a ghost. He was forced to sell his precious vintage car to make the first repayment installment on my trust fund. The day the tow truck came for it, he just stood at the window and watched it go, silent. My siblings reacted in their own ways. Brenda retreated into a world of sullen resentment, while Walter, surprisingly, began to change. Forced to get a real job to pay for his car insurance and phone bill, he started to grasp the concept of earning a living for the first time in his 27 years. There were arguments, slammed doors, and tense, silent dinners. I acted as the reluctant enforcer, reviewing the weekly expense reports submitted by the new estate manager, approving funds for necessities, and denying requests for luxuries. It was exhausting, and I felt less like a daughter and more like a warden. But beneath the tension, something else was happening. For the first time, there were consequences. For the first time, there was accountability. The lies had stopped because there was simply no money to fund them anymore. The healing, when it began, was not a sudden breakthrough, but a slow, quiet dawn. As the seasons changed, so did the emotional climate in our home. I returned to Boston to finish my degree, the distance providing a necessary space for growth. The weekly financial update calls, once tense and transactional, slowly evolved. My father, Arthur, started a small woodworking business in the garage, restoring antique furniture. For the first time, I heard genuine pride in his voice as he talked about the grain of a piece of oak or a perfectly executed dovetail joint. He was building something real with his own two hands, not chasing fantasies. My mother, Dolores, in the most surprising turn of all, started volunteering at the Hudson Valley Historical Society. She began using her knowledge of the town's prominent families to archive old photographs and documents, connecting with the very legacy she'd nearly auctioned off. One evening, she called me, not to complain, but to excitedly describe a set of architectural drawings from the 1,890 she had helped identify. It was a brief, unguarded moment of shared passion, a tiny seed of a new connection. My brother, Walter, even started talking about saving for a down payment on a small condo. The repayment of my $50,000 continued, each month a consistent, quiet apology. The family I came home to that Christmas was gone, and for that, I was grateful. What was emerging in its place was something quieter, more honest, and built not on a foundation of lies, but on the hard ground of consequence. Now, we come to the final part of this journey. What is the lesson in all of this? What is the moral at the end of these painful family revenge stories? For the longest time, I thought justice was the point. Getting back what was taken, forcing accountability, watching consequences play out, and that is a vital part of it. Without justice, there can be no peace. But as time went on, I realized the true transformation wasn't in them, it was in me. I learned that forgiveness isn't about absolving them for what they did. It's about absolving yourself from the burden of carrying their poison. My forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant accepting that I could not change who they were, but I had absolute power over who I was going to be. The real victory wasn't in that lawyer's office. It was in the quiet moments months later when I could answer a call from my mother without my heart seizing up with anxiety, or when I could listen to my father talk about his woodworking without the sting of past betrayals. It was the realization that my peace of mind was not contingent on their apology. The legacy my grandfather truly wanted to protect wasn't the house or the money. It was the strength of character to stand up for what is right, even when you're standing alone against your own blood. Real family isn't about unconditional acceptance of toxic behavior. It's about a shared commitment to truth, respect, and growth, even when it's born from the ashes of a painful reckoning. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of reclaiming your own narrative, please subscribe and join our community. This is a space where we know that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family and for yourself is to teach them how to treat you.